Greetings, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me again. This is the next episode, episode number 6 of this series about implementing the CQRS pattern inside of a web API project developed with ASP.NET Core. So I hope you've already watched the previous episode. If that's not the case, please make sure you do, because as I've told you before, what we talk about in each episode is kind of related to what we have developed in the previous videos. So I've got my Visual Studio open. I've got my notes inside of my VS Code window. We're going to take it one step at a time, and we're going to see how we are going to continue implementing the CQRS pattern with the MediatR library. Episode number 6, calling and testing our getEmployees query. So this section demonstrates how to call the getEmployees query from our employees controller and test it using Postman. Either Postman or this HTTP file, doesn't matter. So now we have set up our query, we have set up our handler. The next step is to create an action method inside of this controller, right? And using that action method, we're going to create our query, dispatch it using the mediator that we've got here, right, as a dependency. And that mediator will know how to handle that request using the handler and then return the response. So to the notes, controllers, employee controllers, right? So basically what we can do here, as you can see, I have created an endpoint called getEmployees. It is going to return a task of action result. It is like a get endpoint. And then using our dependency on our mediator, we're going to call this send method. If you recall, in the previous episodes, I talked about two different interfaces, right? iSender is used when you want to send one single request that is going to get handled by one handler. It is called iSender. iPublisher is used when you want to send notifications. So a request that is going to be handled by more than one handler. Here, because we're using the iMediator, we have access to both publisher and sender. Here, because we want our request, our query to be handled by only one handler, which is getEmployees handler in this case, right? We are going to use the send method. So mediator.send, mediator.send, right? This is the mediator that is going to get injected into this controller at startup because we have configured it inside of our program.cs, right? So we are going to create a new instance of our request. Our request doesn't need to have any input parameters. Sometimes a request or a query needs to have like an input parameter. For example, suppose you want to have a query that fetches one single employee based on the ID. So in that case, whenever you want to create your query, you need to pass the ID of the employee that you want to fetch. But in this case, because we're going to fetch all of the employees inside of our data store, right? We do not need to pass in the ID of that employee. So basically, we create a new object of our query, and then we use the send method on our mediator, and then we're going to capture the result that send method is going to return inside of this variable, which is going to be a list of employees. And then we're going to return an OK action result, and we're going to pass in that employees inside of that. One thing that I want you to notice is that right now, my controller doesn't have a dependency on my fake data store. It only has a dependency, as of now, it only has a dependency on this iMediator. So think about this. In the past, maybe you have developed, right, an application where you are injecting the repository or your database context directly inside of your controller. But here, that's not the case. The dependency on that fake data store, if you recall, is inside of the handler. So if you go to the handler, you will see that this handler depends on the fake data store. So this fake data store could be a repository, could be a service class, right? That communicates with a database, with a backend API, and whatnot. But again, as I told you, right now, our controller doesn't have any dependencies on our repository, fake data store, or I don't know, like an application service. The dependency is only on the mediator, right? And then the mediator is going to mediate, is going to handle the communication between the query, the handler, and again here you do not see anything about the handler. All you're doing is creating this query and dispatching the query using the mediator.send, and then you receive the response. So the mediator is going to handle the communication between the query and its handler, is going to run the code inside of this handle method. Where did it go? Here. And is going to return this list of employees, and then inside of your controller you can capture that inside of this employees variable, and finally you're going to use it here. This is the flow. I know maybe I've explained this in so much detail, but I want you to understand what is happening here. So we add an HTTP GET endpoint in our controller. When this endpoint is hit, we create an instance of our query. We use the send method of our mediator, and then we've got a handler for that query. The handler is going to retrieve the employees, and then we're going to return an OK response. And as I told you, the controller doesn't have a direct dependency on fake data store, or it doesn't have any knowledge of how the query is going to get handled. Nothing. It just knows that in order to get a list of employees, there is a query called get employees query. So I need to instantiate that. I'm going to send it with my mediator, and that's it. I don't care who is going to handle that. I don't care how it's going to get handled. Maybe the handler is going to communicate with a repository. Maybe, I don't know, with a backend API. I don't care. That's not my concern. So my controller is very clean. It just instantiates the query, receives the response, and then returns back the response. So yeah, testing with Postman is going to be very easy, either with Postman or with the HTTP file that we've got. So inside of my employee controller, if I navigate, by the way, to episode number 6, this is the code that I've got here, right? This is the code. So basically what we need to do is I've got this request here. You see here? So this is the base address of my employee. And then if I run my API, right? If I run my API and then send this request, you will see that our fake data store is gonna return the list of employees using that mediator library. That's the result. Okay, so this is the mediator library and the CQRS pattern at work. They are communicating with one another. We're dispatching our query. We don't care. This is very important. We don't care. Inside of our controller, we don't care how that query is going to get handled. We don't care. It's not our concern. The handler can do whatever it wants. It can communicate with some backend endpoints. It can communicate with like a repository, and then it can aggregate like all of the data and then return whatever we expect to get. So this method is going to be responsible for handling all of the work that is required to be done in order for that request to be fulfilled. And your controller will be very clean using this pattern. So yeah, using Postman, you can also test this. It doesn't matter whether Postman or like a file, it doesn't matter. We're gonna send this GET request, and then inside of this response, we're gonna receive this. This confirms that the mediator is working currently and correctly, and our first query in CQRS is implemented. And that was it, guys, for this episode. I hope you've enjoyed watching it. And if that's the case, give it a thumbs up, please. Like this video, share it with a friend, subscribe to the channel. I don't want you to miss out on any of my upcoming videos, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.